The forest is supposed to be a place of peace, a retreat from the chaos of the world. But on one cold October afternoon, when retired Sheriff Martin Webb steps off the trail, the silence is shattered by a sound that freezes him in place. A scream. Piercing, desperate, and inhuman. Years of experience tell him to turn back, to call for help. But something deeper pulls him forward, into the shadows, where the truth waits, tangled in wire, fighting for its life. Paralyzed by instinct and dread, Martin pushes toward the source, only to uncover something far more horrifying than he imagined. What he finds will change everything, forcing him to face not just the cruelty of man, but a choice that could alter the course of his own life forever. And what secrets lie hidden behind this haunting discovery in the forest? Stay tuned as we uncover the deep secrets of the forest. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories.
The October air bit at Martin Webb's cheeks as he trudged along the familiar hiking trail in the Adirondack forest. At 58, his steps weren't as spry as they once were, but these weekend hikes had become essential therapy since his retirement from the county sheriff's department 3 years ago. The forest had always been his sanctuary, a place where the memories of 30 years of seeing humanity at its worst could dissolve among the ancient trees and whispering leaves. His wife, Eleanor, had encouraged his solo excursions despite her own battle with rheumatoid arthritis, keeping her homebound more often these days. "The forest heals you," she'd told him that morning, pressing a thermos of coffee into his weathered hands. "It always brings you back to me a little more whole." Martin had ventured farther than usual today, leaving the marked trail behind to explore a creek bed he discovered last week. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy overhead, painting dappled shadows across the forest floor. He had just stopped to take a swig from his water bottle when the sound reached him. Distant at first, but unmistakable. A scream. High-pitched, guttural, and filled with pain. Martin froze, the plastic bottle halfway to his lips. 30 years of law enforcement had trained his ears to distinguish between sounds, between the innocent and the ominous. This was neither human nor the typical call of forest wildlife. Yet it carried an unmistakable quality of suffering that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Another scream tore through the silence, louder this time. Closer. Martin's hand instinctively reached for his hip, seeking the service weapon that was no longer there. His heart hammered against his ribs as he listened, trying to pinpoint the direction. The screams continued, interspersed with what sounded like desperate thrashing. "Hello," he called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the hushed forest. No response came except another wailing cry. Logic told him to turn back, to call the ranger station and report the disturbance. He was just one aging man, unarmed in the middle of nowhere. But 3 decades of running toward danger instead of away from it had hardwired certain responses into his system. Martin took a deep breath and moved toward the sounds, stepping carefully over fallen logs and through dense underbrush. The screams grew more frantic, punctuated by hisses and what sounded like labored breathing. As he pushed through a thicket of mountain laurel, the cries led him to a small clearing. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just ferns, rocks, and the dappled forest floor. Then a slight movement caught his eye near the base of a large hemlock. Something writhed beneath a twisted mass of what looked like garbage. Martin approached cautiously, his heart still thundering in his chest. Using a fallen branch, he gently prodded at the bundle. The screaming intensified, and the mass shifted violently. It wasn't garbage. It was a bag, a feed sack or fertilizer bag, tied shut with baling wire and coated with dirt and leaves, as if someone had attempted to conceal it. Something alive was trapped inside. Martin dropped to his knees, pulling his pocket knife from his jacket. With trembling fingers, he began cutting through the wire binding the bag closed. The creature inside thrashed more violently, those terrible screams now accompanied by deep, threatening growls. "Easy," Martin murmured, though he knew his words meant nothing to whatever was inside. "I'm trying to help you." As he pulled the last of the wire free and carefully opened the bag, he jerked backward in shock. A pair of wild, golden eyes glared back at him from a dirt-matted, tawny face. The bobcat, for that's what it unmistakably was, lay on its side, its body contorted within the confines of the sack. A second wire had been cruelly wrapped around its legs, binding them painfully close to its body. The animal hissed, revealing sharp teeth, but the threat display lacked strength. Martin could see its sides heaving with each labored breath, ribs prominently visible beneath its once beautiful coat. The bobcat was severely emaciated, dehydrated, and weak, but alive and fighting. "Who did this to you?" Martin whispered, anger rising in his chest. In all his years of law enforcement, cruelty toward animals had always struck him as particularly heinous, the mark of a truly twisted soul. The bobcat convulsed suddenly, its eyes rolling back momentarily. Martin knew he had minutes, not hours, to act. He quickly shrugged off his jacket, preparing to use it as a makeshift carrier. With extreme caution, he worked to free the wire from around the animal's legs, talking softly all the while. "I know you're scared. I know this hurts, but I'm going to get you help." The bobcat was too weak to put up much resistance. When Martin finally lifted the animal, still partially wrapped in his jacket, he was shocked at how light it felt, perhaps 15 pounds when it should have weighed twice that. Its breathing was ragged, each inhalation a visible struggle. Martin glanced at his watch. It was nearly 5 p.m. on a Sunday. The ranger station was at least 4 miles back, and there was no guarantee anyone would still be there. The nearest town, Millfield, was about 3 miles in the opposite direction, down the mountain. There was a veterinary clinic there. He'd passed it countless times on his way to the trailhead. Cradling the bobcat against his chest, Martin began moving as quickly as he dared through the forest. The animal had stopped struggling, which worried him more than its earlier fight. Occasionally, it would emit a weak cry, almost a whimper, that tore at Martin's heart. "Stay with me," he urged, picking up his pace. Just a little longer. By the time Martin stumbled out of the forest and onto the road leading into Millfield, sweat soaked his shirt despite the cool autumn air. His arms ached from carrying the bobcat, and his legs burned from maintaining a near jog for over 2 miles. The animal had grown disturbingly quiet, its breathing shallow and irregular. Millfield was a small town of barely 2,000 souls, with a single main street lined with brick buildings dating back to the early 1900s. The Adirondack Mountains brought enough tourism to keep the place alive, but just barely. As Martin hurried down Cedar Street, several people stopped to stare at the wild-eyed man carrying a bundle of jacket that occasionally twitched. The veterinary clinic, Millfield Animal Hospital according to the simple green sign, sat at the far end of the main street. Martin's heart sank when he saw the darkened windows and the closed sign hanging on the door. Still, he rushed forward, pounding on the door with his free hand. "Hello? Anyone there?" "Emergency," he shouted, peering through the glass. To his immense relief, a light flicked on in the back of the clinic, and a moment later, a young woman in scrubs appeared at the door, her expression wary. "We're closed until," she began, then stopped when she saw what Martin was carrying. "What's that?" "A bobcat," Martin gasped. "Found it trapped in the woods. It's dying." The woman, her name tag read Jessie, hesitated only a moment before unlocking the door. "Dr. Reyes just finished surgery on a dog. I'll get her." Martin followed Jessie into the small clinic. The waiting room was empty, chairs stacked against one wall as if recently mopped around. Jessie disappeared through a swinging door, and moments later returned with an older woman with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a tight bun. "I'm Dr. Maria Reyes," she said briskly, eyeing the bundle in Martin's arms. "Jessie says you've got a bobcat?" "Yes," Martin replied, carefully opening his jacket to reveal the now barely conscious animal. Found it tied up in a bag in the woods. Been like this for days, by the look of it. Dr. Reyes's expression hardened as she took in the bobcat's condition. Without another word, she gestured for Martin to follow her through the swinging doors into a treatment room. On the table, she instructed, pulling on a pair of latex gloves. Carefully, as Martin laid the bobcat down, Dr. Reyes immediately began her examination, speaking rapid Spanish to Jessie, who moved with practiced efficiency around the small room, gathering supplies. Severe dehydration, Dr. Reyes muttered. Malnourished. Possible internal injuries. She glanced up at Martin. How long was it in that bag? No idea, Martin replied. I was hiking when I heard screaming. Found it maybe an hour ago. Dr. Reyes nodded grimly. We need to stabilize her first. For fluids, antibiotics. She pressed a stethoscope to the bobcat's chest. Heart rate is dangerously low. Jessie, prepare the oxygen and set up for a blood draw. Martin stood back, watching as the two women worked with quick, sure movements. The bobcat, a female he now knew, lay motionless on the metal table as Dr. Reyes inserted an IV catheter into one of her forelegs and Jessie placed a tiny oxygen mask over her muzzle. Will she make it? Martin asked after several minutes of tense silence broken only by Dr. Reyes's terse instructions to her assistant. The veterinarian glanced up, her dark eyes unreadable. Hard to say. She's young, maybe 2 years old. That's in her favor. But she's been through hell. She straightened up, rolling her shoulders. Are you the one who did this? The question hit Martin like a physical blow. What? No. I told you. I found her like this. Dr. Reyes studied his face for a long moment before nodding. I had to ask. You'd be surprised what people bring in, acting like heroes when they're the ones who caused the damage. Martin understood her caution all too well. I was a sheriff for 30 years before I retired. I've seen plenty of that myself. Something in Dr. Reyes's posture relaxed slightly. You can wait outside if you want. This will take some time. Martin hesitated, looking down at the bobcat. Her golden eyes were closed now, her breathing steadier under the oxygen mask. Actually, I should call my wife. Let her know what's happening. As Martin stepped into the waiting room, the reality of what he'd done began to sink in. He'd rescued a wild animal, a predator, and brought it to a small-town vet who likely had limited experience with wildlife. What would happen to the bobcat if she survived? Would she be released back into the wild? Could she survive there after this trauma? He pulled out his cell phone and dialed home. Eleanor answered on the third ring. Martin, are you all right? It's getting dark. He realized with a start that the sun had indeed set. What had begun as a routine Sunday hike had turned into something entirely unexpected. I'm fine, Ellie, he assured her, lowering himself into one of the waiting room chairs. But I'm going to be late. I found a bobcat in the forest. Someone had trapped it in a bag and left it to die. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. A bobcat. Eleanor finally responded. Martin Webb. Only you would find a wild animal in distress and bring it to town instead of calling animal control. Despite everything, Martin smiled. After 35 years of marriage, Eleanor knew him better than he knew himself sometimes. The ranger station was too far, and it wouldn't have survived the wait. I'm at the vet clinic in Millfield now. Dr. Reyes is working on her. Her. The bobcat. It's a female. Young one. Eleanor sighed, but Martin could hear the fondness in it. And how long do you plan to stay there? Martin watched through the glass panel of the swinging door as Dr. Reyes bent over the examination table, her face intent with concentration. I don't know, Ellie. I can't just leave her here. Of course you can't, Eleanor replied, and Martin could picture her shaking her head, that small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Call me when you know more. After hanging up, Martin settled in to wait. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, and the small town grew quiet. Occasionally, A car would pass on the main street, headlights sweeping briefly across the clinic windows. Martin checked his watch. Nearly 7 p.m. now. The swinging door opened, and Jessie emerged, looking tired. "Dr. Reyes asked me to update you," she said, dropping into a chair across from Martin. "The bobcat is stable for now. We've got her on fluids and antibiotics, and we've treated the wounds from the wire. She's also severely malnourished, so we're going to try some liquid nutrition once she's a bit stronger. But she'll live." Jessie's expression was cautious. "It's still touch and go. The next 24 hours will tell us a lot. Dr. Reyes is calling a wildlife specialist in Albany for consultation." Martin nodded, relief and concern warring within him. "I should probably go home then." "You can leave your number," Jessie suggested. "We'll call with updates." Martin wrote his name and number on a slip of paper, then added, "I'd like to help with her care, if possible. And the expenses." Jessie looked surprised. "That's generous, but wildlife rehabilitation can get expensive." "I understand," Martin replied. "But someone needs to be responsible for what happened to her. Might as well be me." As Martin drove home that night, the image of those golden eyes haunted him. There was something in them beyond the wild fear of a trapped animal, something like accusation. As if the bobcat were asking, "How could your kind do this to me?" He had no answer. Over the next week, Martin found himself drawn back to the Millfield Animal Hospital daily. Dr. Reyes had been skeptical of his continued interest at first, but as days passed and the bobcat, whom the clinic staff had taken to calling Goldie for her amber eyes, began to show improvement, the veterinarian warmed to his presence. "She ate a little solid food today," Dr. Reyes told him on the 5th day, allowing him to peer through the window of the isolation room where Goldie was kept. The bobcat lay curled on a blanket, her eyes closed but her breathing steady and strong. "Not much, but it's progress." Martin nodded, feeling an unexpected swell of pride. "She's a fighter." "Yes," Dr. Reyes agreed. "But we have a problem." Martin turned to her, questioning. "The wildlife rehabilitator from the state came yesterday while you were gone. He says Goldie's case is complicated. The physical wounds will heal, but she's been traumatized. And she's been in human care during a critical period of development. He's not sure she can be successfully released back into the wild." "What happens to her then?" Dr. Reyes sighed. "Normally, she'd go to a wildlife sanctuary or educational facility. But with budget cuts, many are at capacity. And bobcats aren't exactly the cuddly exhibits people line up to see." A weight settled in Martin's chest. "So what are the options?" "Euthanasia is one," Dr. Reyes said bluntly. "But I don't want to give up on her yet. We're reaching out to some private wildlife sanctuaries. In the meantime, she can stay here while she recovers." Martin nodded, his eyes drawn back to the sleeping bobcat. "I want to help more. Not just with the bills." Dr. Reyes studied him for a long moment. "You were an officer of the law. I'm sure you understand that wild animals aren't pets, Mr. Webb." "Of course," Martin replied quickly. "But I've read that animals in rehabilitation need socialization, enrichment. I have time on my hands these days." To his surprise, Dr. Reyes smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "Come back tomorrow morning. I'll show you how to feed her without losing a finger." And so began Martin's unexpected apprenticeship in wildcat rehabilitation. Each day, he would arrive at the clinic mid-morning and stay for several hours, helping with Goldie's care under Dr. Reyes's strict supervision. At first, the bobcat would retreat to the far corner of her enclosure when he entered, hissing warnings that needed no translation. But as days stretched into weeks, something shifted. Goldie began to watch Martin with curiosity rather than fear. She would take food from the long tongs he offered, sometimes even approaching when he spoke to her in the low, gentle voice he'd developed just for her. "You're gaining her trust," Dr. Reyes observed one afternoon in late November, as they watched Goldie bat at an enrichment toy Martin had constructed from feathers and string. "That's unusual. Maybe she remembers," Martin suggested, "that I was the one who found her." Dr. Reyes shrugged. Or maybe she just recognizes kindness when she sees it. Animals often do, more reliably than people. By Thanksgiving, Goldie had regained most of her weight. Her coat gleamed with health, and her movements had regained the fluid grace so characteristic of her species. The wounds from the wire had healed, leaving only thin lines of scar tissue beneath her fur. But the question of her future loomed larger with each passing day. No luck with the sanctuaries? Martin asked Dr. Reyes after finishing Goldie's afternoon feeding. The bobcat had actually taken a piece of chicken directly from the tongs today, her rough tongue briefly touching Martin's fingers through the protective gloves. Dr. Reyes shook her head. One in Pennsylvania might have space after the new year. But it's not ideal. They focus more on big cats. Goldie would be an afterthought. Martin's frown deepened. Over the past weeks, he'd grown attached to the bobcat in a way he hadn't anticipated. He found himself thinking about her during his evenings at home, sharing stories of her progress with Eleanor over dinner. To his surprise, Eleanor had shown increasing interest in the bobcat's recovery. Bring a picture next time, she'd instructed him. I want to see this miracle cat that's got you acting like a schoolboy with his first pet. That night, as they sat in their living room, Martin in his recliner, Eleanor on the couch with her knitting, he finally voiced the thought that had been growing in his mind. What if we took her? Eleanor's knitting needles paused mid-stitch. Took who? Goldie. The bobcat. Eleanor stared at him. Martin, that's a wild animal, not a house cat. I know, he acknowledged, but she might not be able to go back to the wild now. And the sanctuaries are full. Dr. Reyes says she's imprinted on humans during her recovery. She needs special care. And you think we should provide that care? Here, Eleanor gestured around their modest home, with its comfortable but worn furniture and the photographs of their 3 grown children adorning the walls. We have the space, Martin pointed out. That old workshop behind the garage, we could convert it, make it a proper enclosure. I've been reading about private ownership of rescued wildcats. It's possible with the right permits. Eleanor set her knitting aside. Martin Webb, I've known you for almost 40 years. I've seen you bring home injured birds, adopt 3 stray dogs, and raise an orphan squirrel. But a bobcat? That's something else entirely. Martin nodded, acknowledging the truth of her words. I know it sounds crazy, Ellie, but someone hurt her, someone human. Don't we owe her something better than euthanasia or being forgotten in some overcrowded sanctuary? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, studying her husband's face. You really care about this animal, don't you? I do, Martin admitted. I can't explain it. But from the moment I heard those screams in the forest, it's like I was meant to find her. Eleanor sighed, but there was a softness in her eyes that Martin recognized. The same look she'd had 35 years ago when she'd agreed to marry a young deputy with more idealism than sense. Let me meet her first, she said finally. Then we'll talk about turning our backyard into a bobcat sanctuary. The next day, Martin brought Eleanor to the Millfield Animal Hospital. Dr. Reyes, initially skeptical about the visit, had agreed after Martin explained their conversation. I want to be very clear, the veterinarian said as she led them to Goldie's enclosure. Bobcats are not pets. Even one raised in captivity or rehabilitated by humans remains a wild animal with wild instincts. They require specialized care, specific dietary needs, and proper housing. We understand, Eleanor assured her. Martin's told me everything. I just wanted to see her for myself. As they approached the enclosure, Goldie was lounging on a shelf that had been installed as part of her enrichment. At their approach, she lifted her head, those golden eyes immediately finding Martin's face. To everyone's surprise, she stood and stretched, then moved to the front of the enclosure. She recognizes you, Eleanor murmured, watching as the bobcat rubbed against the wire mesh separating them. She usually does that when it's feeding time, Martin explained, though he couldn't deny the warm feeling that spread through his chest at the bobcat's apparent greeting. Dr. Reyes observed the interaction with professional interest. "She's certainly bonded with you, Mr. Webb. That's unusual for a wild-born bobcat, especially one that experienced trauma at human hands." Eleanor stepped closer to the enclosure, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. Goldie watched her approach, ears twitching forward with curiosity rather than lying flat in fear. "She's beautiful," Eleanor whispered. "Those eyes." Martin watched his wife and the bobcat regarding each other with mutual curiosity. There was something powerful in that moment, a recognition between two female spirits, one human and one wild, but both survivors in their own way. Eleanor turned to Dr. Reyes. "What would we need to do to give her a proper home?" Dr. Reyes blinked in surprise. "You're serious about this?" "My husband rarely gets notions," Eleanor replied with a small smile. "But when he does, they tend to be worth listening to." Over the next hour, Dr. Reyes outlined what would be required: the permits from the State Wildlife Agency, the proper enclosure specifications, the dietary needs, the veterinary care, and the commitment that might last 15 years or more. As they drove home that afternoon, Martin reached across the center console to squeeze Eleanor's hand. "Thank you for considering this." Eleanor smiled. "Did you see how she looked at you? Like she knew exactly who you were." She paused. "Besides, that old workshop has been gathering dust since you retired. Might as well put it to good use." The transformation of the Webb's property began the following week. Martin, with help from their oldest son Michael and several friends from his sheriff's department days, set to work converting the old workshop into what Dr. Reyes deemed a suitable bobcat habitat. The interior was fitted with shelves at various heights for climbing, a small pool for drinking and play, and hiding spots created from hollow logs and artificial rock formations. An outdoor enclosure was constructed off one side, surrounded by heavy-gauge wire mesh that extended below ground to prevent digging and curved inward at the top to prevent climbing out. The permit process was complex but navigable with Dr. Reyes's guidance and a letter of support from the wildlife rehabilitator who had assessed Goldie's case. By Christmas, the enclosure was complete, the permits were in order, and the Webbs were ready to bring Goldie home. The day of the transfer, a light snow fell across the Adirondack foothills, dusting the Webb's property in white. Dr. Reyes herself brought Goldie to the house, the bobcat sedated for the journey and resting in a large carrier. "Remember, she'll be disoriented at first," Dr. Reyes cautioned as they carried the carrier to the newly converted workshop. "Give her space. Don't try to interact for at least the first day." Martin nodded, his heart racing with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. "We've got everything ready." They placed the carrier in the center of the main room and opened its door, then retreated behind a barrier they'd constructed specifically for observation. Gradually, Goldie began to stir, the sedation wearing off. Her golden eyes blinked open, confused at first, then increasingly alert as she took in her new surroundings. With characteristic caution, she emerged from the carrier, sniffing the air and moving with deliberate slowness across the floor. Martin held his breath as she explored, testing each new surface, investigating each hiding spot. "So far, so good," Dr. Reyes whispered. "This is a positive first reaction." They watched for another hour as Goldie familiarized herself with the indoor portion of her new home. She seemed particularly drawn to a high shelf that offered a view of the entire space. "A predator's preferred vantage point," Dr. Reyes explained. Before leaving, the veterinarian reviewed the feeding schedule once more and promised to check in regularly. "You're doing a good thing," she told the Webbs. Not everyone would open their home to a wild creature like this. After Dr. Reyes departed, Martin and Eleanor spent the rest of the day taking turns observing Goldie from behind the barrier. By evening, the bobcat had settled on her high shelf, grooming herself with apparent contentment. "I think she likes it," Martin said as they prepared for bed that night. Eleanor smiled. "It's just the beginning, you know. We've got years ahead of us with our new neighbor." Martin nodded, feeling a strange sense of rightness settle over him. I wonder if we'll ever find out who did that to her. Does it matter? Eleanor asked. We can't change what happened to her. We can only make sure her future is better than her past. As Martin drifted off to sleep that night, he thought about the journey that had brought them here, from those terrifying screams in the forest to the peaceful wildcat now residing in their backyard. The people responsible for Goldie's suffering had never been found, despite Martin filing reports with both the sheriff's department and the state wildlife agency. But perhaps Eleanor was right. What mattered now wasn't the cruelty that had nearly ended Goldie's life, but the unexpected bond that had formed in its aftermath, a connection between a retired lawman and a wild creature, both finding new purpose in their unlikely friendship. Spring came to the Adirondacks, melting the snow and bringing new life to the forest. In the months since Goldie had come to live with the Webbs, she had flourished. Her coat gleamed with health, and she had grown more comfortable with her human caretakers, even allowing Martin to enter her enclosure for feeding and cleaning without retreating to her hiding spots. Dr. Reyes, who visited monthly to check on Goldie's progress, marveled at the transformation. She's thriving, she told Martin during her April visit. I wouldn't have believed a wild bobcat could adapt so well to captivity. She knows she's safe here, Martin replied, watching as Goldie lounged in a patch of sunlight in her outdoor enclosure, seemingly content to observe the birds flitting among the trees beyond her fence. Word of the Webb's unusual rescue had spread through Millfield and neighboring communities. Occasionally, school groups would visit to learn about bobcats and wildlife conservation, with Martin serving as an enthusiastic guide. He'd discovered a talent for education that he'd never known he possessed, using Goldie's story to teach about respect for wildlife and the importance of protecting natural habitats. On a warm day in late May, Martin was tending to the garden Eleanor had planted near Goldie's enclosure when a sheriff's department vehicle pulled into their driveway. Deputy Collins, a young officer who had joined the force after Martin's retirement, stepped out. Mr. Webb, he called, approaching the garden. Got a minute? Martin straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. What brings you out here, Collins? The deputy glanced toward Goldie's enclosure, where the bobcat was watching them with typical feline indifference. Actually, it's about your bobcat. Or rather, the case of how she ended up in that bag. Martin's heart quickened. You found something? Collins nodded. Game wardens picked up a couple of poachers last week. Father and son operation. They've been trapping illegally throughout the county for years. During questioning, the son mentioned trapping a bobcat last fall that got away. Got away, Martin repeated, frowning. Goldie was tied up in a bag when I found her. According to their statement, they caught her in a leg trap, illegal for bobcats, by the way. But when they went to check their traps, she was still alive and apparently pretty fierce. The father got scratched up trying to kill her, so they bagged her up, planning to come back and finish the job after tending to his wounds. When they returned, the bag was gone. Martin felt a chill despite the warm day. They just left her there to suffer. Collins nodded grimly. They're facing multiple charges: illegal trapping, poaching endangered species, animal cruelty. The prosecutor asked if you'd be willing to testify about finding the bobcat. Of course, Martin replied without hesitation. After the deputy left, Martin walked over to Goldie's enclosure. The bobcat had moved to a perch near the fence line, her golden eyes regarding him with what he'd come to recognize as curiosity rather than fear. We found them, he told her softly, knowing she couldn't understand his words, but feeling the need to say them anyway. The men who hurt you won't hurt anyone else. Goldie blinked slowly at him, a gesture that, in cats, signified trust and affection. That evening, as Martin and Eleanor sat on their back porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and amber that reminded him of Goldie's eyes, he reflected on the strange journey of the past 8 months. Do you ever regret it? He asked Eleanor, who was sketching Goldie in the art pad that had become her new hobby. Taking on a bobcat at our age? Eleanor looked up from her drawing, her face softened by the evening light. Not for a moment. She's brought something special into our lives." She smiled. "Besides, who else would have transformed an entire workshop into a bobcat palace?" Martin laughed, reaching over to squeeze his wife's hand. "When I heard those screams in the forest that day, I was terrified. Never imagined it would lead to all this." "Life's funny that way," Eleanor mused. "Sometimes the most frightening moments lead to the most beautiful outcomes." In her enclosure, visible through the twilight, Goldie stretched languidly on her favorite perch, secure in her unusual home. Once a victim of human cruelty, she had become an ambassador for her species and a source of purpose for the retired sheriff who had followed screams in the forest and found not danger, but a new chapter in his life's journey. Sometimes, Martin reflected, watching as Goldie settled into sleep, the things that freeze us with fear are actually calling us toward our greatest purpose. All we need is the courage to move forward, one step at a time, into the unknown.